Okay, Jaret, welcome to Interview with a Gamer. You are interview number 4, so I hope you're feeling proud, excited,
Apprehensive.
amazed, apprehensive, nervous, uh, inquisitive as to what the hell this is going to be, and all of those things are fine. Um, this is a chance for me to ask in a little bit of a deeper way why people game, what kind of games they play, what they look for when they're gaming, what they wish gaming did or didn't do, what works or doesn't work when they game, and generally, what are your preferences? So, a lot of these questions are not right or wrong, they're about who you are. And who you are is going to be distinct from someone else. So there's no category you have to fit, no box you have to fit into.
That's good because as opposed to the last time around, I've not done any homework. So that's good that the questions are going to be easy.
That's totally fine. Um, so the first question is pretty broad. When did you first start to play, first of all, any games whatsoever, and then more specifically, video games in your life?
Sure. I've played board games with family as far back as I can think. Video games, I remember being excited about the Nintendo Entertainment System coming out in the mid 80s. Friends had Activision and ColecoVision and those sort of things before that, but the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES was the first, the NES was the first that I ever played. At about the same time, though, I did pick up Dungeons and Dragons, and like the shirt that I wear is my first Dungeons and Dragons experience, the original red box game, the Beckme games from the mid '80s.
So, do you remember your first video game?
First video game. My first video game was probably in an arcade, so it would have been something along the lines of Pacman or Centipede or one of like the original arcade games. I know there was a RV resort that we went to, and they had a couple of video games in their machine there. The first one I ever played and owned myself was Super Mario Brothers.
Okay, I'm going to go off script for a second and talk about Dungeons and Dragons because you brought it up. I'm fascinated by this. I know you are. This is something that we have in common. To what extent is your Dungeons and Dragons experience, both growing up and today, parallel to, intertwined with your experience playing video games? Is it the same muscles that you're exercising when you play? Is it totally something different? Can you get the same things from video games that you get from Dungeons and Dragons and vice versa, or are they quite distinct for you?
Interesting question. I think early on they were very distinct from one another. So there were no online games, right? There were very few multiplayer games, and when they were multiplayer games, they were two-player games. So I would say when I started to play video games, they were either a very solitary experience or maybe you and a couple of friends would play together. When four-player arcade games came out, that was huge. But Dungeons and Dragons had always been played in groups of four and five and six people. So there was a social component to tabletop role playing that the video games simply did not have at that time.
So when you play Dungeons and Dragons, are you experiencing the same kind of dopamine rush, the same the same connectivity as when you're sitting in front of a screen and getting it from a game, whether it's with other people or by yourself, or are they separate experiences even today?
I would say they're more similar today than they ever were before. I game casually now more than a serious amount of time. But when I was playing a lot of games like World of Warcraft, it was because it was effectively a role playing game. You had a character that you were developing and were attached to, and you had the social component of belonging to a guild. And so at that point, they were very similar. It's sort of a convergence of the two media over time.
Are there other games you've played besides World of Warcraft that are very much like D&D?
I mean, I've played a lot of the D&D games, the digital games, the Baldur's Gates, and the sequels to those, Icewind Dale, all of the D&D canon I pretty much played, going back to like the gold box games, which are the like 8-bit, really crude graphics games. But in those, you controlled a whole party. You controlled, say, 5 or 6 characters in a party, whereas in D&D, it's very much about honing that individual character, your tune that you play.
Do you feel that the the kind of like Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale, or even the more modern takes on this. So Pathfinder, whether it's Kingmaker or Wrath of the Righteous, not sure if you've played those, but do you feel that those scratch the same itch? Or do you feel kind of disappointed or let down when you play them because you're not delving into the individual story and characterization and, of course, the social aspect?
For sure. So I'm a little bit of like a concrete sequential sort of engineer type there, in that when I was making characters, there was sort of a min-maxing component. How can I make this character the strongest bard or the best cleric or that sort of thing? Whereas I hung out with a lot of very creative people who were into the characterization and sort of, doing the voices and throwing themselves into those aspects of the character. Even today, and I mean, you've played with me, you've both run games with me and played in games with me. It's more about solving puzzles together, and I don't often put myself in the place of the character. I often play as the player, sort of controlling a character.
Right. It's interesting because when you're playing a digital version of a D&D game, for example, you're kind of both a player, but you're also sort of a DM. You're kind of running your world. Obviously, if we look at Baldur's Gate 3, which is in development, but I think is going to be released within a year. This is Larian Studios, who have made a wonderful reputation for this kind of game. They see themselves as your DM. They see themselves as, imagine a D&D scenario, we're going to create this campaign for you, and we're going to give you maximum choice and possibility, like a regular DM around a table would do. Now, with a game on a computer, there's only so far that they can go with that. But when you're in the experience itself, there is a God complex that you have when you're in front of your computer. Whereas when you're around a table, just by virtue of being around other people, humility comes into play, and you are one of a group.
Yeah, we have so many options where we didn't used to. In a game like World of Warcraft, I'm controlling, many people play multiple characters. I really don't. I would sort of focus on one character. I would grow attached to that character. I would imbue a personality into that character. Whereas if I'm playing a D&D game and I'm controlling a party of 5 or 6, they have their character. They have their story and that is not a part of my experience. And on the other end of the spectrum are the role-playing games where we sit around a table and actually inhabit those characters. Yeah.
So, coming back to video games and the games that you're playing today, I understand that you don't play as much as you used to, but what are the sort of games that you are playing, if you had time or in the last year or so, that you've been able to sink your teeth into, even if it's just for a few hours?
Sure. So I play, on the one hand, very casual games, word puzzle games, that sort of thing, phone games, anything that you're waiting in the dentist's office and you've got 10 or 15 minutes and you can play Wordle or a similar sort of game. The games that I've been trying to get back into, we recently bought a Switch. So my wife and I priced out a couple of PCs. We'd played Lord of the Rings online for quite a long time, and that was really neat because we established a dynamic where I was a dwarf and sort of a healer tank, and she was a ranged damage dealer, and so we really enjoyed playing together and talking about how our characters interact with one another. But we priced out a couple of systems, and we like Macs, and sometimes they can be a bit of a challenge to game with. And so we looked at it and we said there are lots of multiplayer games on the Switch, and it's an easy option. You can go to the store, pick it up, get a couple of games, and start to play. And we play Mario Kart. We love the Lego games. That is one thing I would say through all of the time we've known one another, introduced each other to like Lego Star Wars, all the DC and Marvel Lego games. Those we really enjoy. It's that cooperative element, that two-person co-op is really the sweet spot for us.
Looking back, and I know that this is a question that can have multiple answers. It can be a different answer today as it would have been yesterday, will be tomorrow, will be 5 minutes from now. But what are your favorite games, the most memorable games, the ones that had the biggest impact on you, recognizing that there are sort of two categories here. There's the ones that you can replay over and over and over again, which is what makes it your favorite. But there's also the ones that have a really profound experience for you, but then they're not really a game you're going to play again and again and again. Regardless, what are the ones that have had the biggest impact on you over the years?
That's an interesting question. So I would say certainly the original Nintendo Zelda games. There was something about those games that was really compelling. The original Legend of Zelda, sort of a fully crafted world, a self-consistent, fully crafted world, and a logic to how that game proceeded. I played a ton of Tetris on the Game Boy. Like, I would say that probably bordered on an addiction for a while, right? How long can you play level 9, height 5? Before you crap out on that. So, and you that was the first time you were able to just take it with you and go on holiday and play Game Boy. I would say I played a ton of World of Warcraft. There was a strong social component to that for me, and it was when the first expansion came out. I was living with a couple other guys, and one of them had played since the original World of Warcraft. And so the two others of us jumped in. I was in grad school at the time. I had a ton of free time, and we played together for a while, and then we got level capped, and then we got into a guild, and we started raiding. And we didn't have as much time as some people do for those games, but we would play 3 or 4 nights a week, and we would go and do raids. And that was to grow those characters, get gear, all of that sort of stuff was a lot of fun. And at a time where I could afford all of the time in the world to devote to it.
Going to Legend of Zelda, I can relate. My first game in that series was A Link to the Past. And I just loved it. I could play it over and over and over again. And I never owned it. So I always had to play either on someone else's machine, or I remember you could rent video games at Blockbuster. And that was the game that was always off the shelf, was really hard to find. But when I got it, that and SimCity were the ones that I would just pile hours and hours into.
I piled hours into Civilization, the first Civilization. I mean, it was simple enough that it ran on a 286, but you could put an infinite amount of time into that game. And I think the ability to save and reload games is probably the worst possible idea for that game, because you're trying to eke out every single win and every die roll that's going on in the background. Yeah, the original Super Mario Kart was outstanding. There was something really compelling about it, and I only found out recently it wasn't even a Mario Kart game. It was a karting game, and then they just replaced all the graphics with characters, which is sort of funny in retrospect. But yeah, great game, really addicting.
I read Sid Meier's memoir, where he talks about developing Civilization or Sid Meier's Pirates or many of these games. And in Civilization 2, there was a cheat menu built into the game. And he opposed that. He didn't think it was a good idea. He just thought that you don't make games in order to cheat at them. And yet, that, along with save scumming, make the game even more replayable than they already were. It's kind of part of the charm of those games, is the replayability and seeing, I'm going to go as far as I can, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to go back and I'm going to try it again. And that maximizing your position, or maximizing your decisions, or just getting the right dice roll, as you mentioned, that can make you spend hours and hours more in the game. And if the game's whole purpose is to make you spend time with it, that is a successful gene in the game.
100%. And I'm very much a systems thinker. I always have been. And so in that, I would say, you know what? In this game of Civilization, my strategy is going to be that I'm going to end up doing this thing. So the technology I need to get to is here. And I would build the strategy back from that to say, if I need this piece of technology, how do I get to that part of the tree the fastest? I love the tech tree in that game.
Yeah. Okay, so how often these days do you get to play? How many times a week? How many hours per time? How many times per month, really? How often do you get to play?
Video games specifically, or games?
Let's say video games.
Sure. So video games, I would say I pick up and play briefly a couple of times a week, and then probably one reasonable session where we sit down and have a good long game.
Okay. Here's a question I'm pretty sure I know the answer to. Do you ever live stream gaming?
I do not live stream gaming. No, I do not.
Would you ever be tempted, or do you see the appeal to that? Or also, do you ever watch other people play live streaming?
I have watched a little bit of live streaming. I think it has to be either a really compelling personality or a game that I find really fascinating. So I played a lot of Counterstrike for a while. I could probably watch people play Counterstrike. I'm not tempted so much to do it. I sort of feel about it the same way as I did when blogging first started to become really popular. Was this idea, why would anyone want to listen to the things I have to write about? What is it that's compelling about my story? And yet there are people all over the place that pick it up and do it, and people end up loving it. But yeah, I would have to, as a product manager, I would have to say, what is my unique value proposition? What is the thing that I would bring to this that people would find valuable or entertaining?
Right, right. I probably feel the same way. Like with this project, I've been thinking to myself, I should stream more to understand what that's about, to build a community, to play games in a different kind of way than I normally play them. And yet, I'm always thinking, why would I stream this one? Like, why would anyone care about what I'm doing right now? If I'm building a city in City Skylines, for example, okay, I'm just playing by myself. It's always for me. So why would anyone else want to be part of that? And yet, that's the ethos behind Twitch is that people do. If you're interested in something, someone else is too.
Well, and the idea that people would watch other people play D&D, that had never occurred to me up until I've seen it recently, and people are huge fans of it.
And when you see it happen, it's obvious as to why it's appealing. It's just like watching a television show or a movie. There's a story being told. It's like, or watching an improv show live, a kind of a mixture of those things. You hinted at this before, Jaret. Are games addictive for you?
There have been games certainly that have elements that are addictive. Absolutely. I think for me, gaming, the time that I spend is like a gas, right? It takes the shape of its container. If I had an infinite amount of time, nothing else that I wanted to do, nothing of priority to do, I would probably game more.
Okay, that fits into the next question, which is, should you play games more or less often than you currently do?
That's a really good question. I should play games more often than I do right now.
Okay, cool. Has a game ever made you laugh?
Yes, and I can't like an idea. Nothing comes to mind right away, but there's a lot of really clever writing in games. I think more often than not, it isn't at the humor of something; it's at the shock, right? The laugh from surprise at a twist in a plot line or something. But yes, games have made me laugh.
Has a game ever made you cry?
I don't know. I don't cry often, and it's not a toxic masculinity thing. I get down, and games have definitely got me down. I've watched games where it's dark enough, especially as you know, I love reading dystopian literature. I love playing dystopian type games here and there, and so yeah, a game can get me down for sure.
Okay. Has a game ever made you quit in frustration?
Yes. Absolutely. And that it usually ends up being one of those games that ought not to have a save and reload feature.
Have you ever quit in frustration in a multiplayer scenario?
No. No. If you quit in frustration in a multiplayer scenario, you're playing for the wrong reasons to my mind.
Yeah, got it. Has a game ever made you decide in the game to be less than perfect, to be imperfect in your play?
Absolutely. So I would say Team Fortress is probably the perfect example. So if you look at Civilization as a game where you can figure out precisely the best place to put a city or precisely the best way to build a tech tree, Team Fortress has too much chaos to it. Almost the whole game is good enough. So yeah, absolutely, I would not play that game as a perfectionist. It would drive you nuts.
Okay. Has a game ever made you decide to change your life?
Not offhand. I would say I was playing way too much World of Warcraft, and when I knocked that back, it did change my life a little bit. It was just way too much gaming, and I found time, out of doors.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Has a game ever? Well, I mean, I'm trying to find a better way to ask this question because I think it's obvious. The question is, has a game ever taught you something? I mean, yeah, games teach us all the time, but they teach us things in the game. They teach us how to play the game. They teach us things about the world. They teach us things about ourselves. Sometimes they teach us things about other people that we're playing with. What do games usually teach you, and what do you most enjoy about their teaching?
Sure. So I would say I've always been, as I said earlier, I've been sort of drawn to systems thinking. And so a lot of games have taught me different ways to conceive of systems, how different things interact with one another, how you can work to optimize outcomes. I would say that's probably something in my day job where I work with about a lot of developers, a lot of very technical people. I work with clinicians. I work with sales and marketing people. It is a system, and you need to satisfy a lot of competing objectives. I think that's another thing in games. I've rarely do I go in and build all the way into one particular skill set, whether it's a tabletop or a video game. I would rather be a generalist so that I can approach problems in a more varied way, right? And I would say playing World of Warcraft, we had a 25 person guild, or we would go on 25-person raids. And when we started that, I thought, is there any way that this can work? Can 25 people who have never met work towards an objective like this in mini teams? There's a healing team and a damage team and a tank team. And so it was impressive to me that people could work at a distance like that towards an objective in an effective way.
Other than World of Warcraft, is there a game that has helped you the most with that systems thinking, or that would be the most advantageous for you to play to develop that skill?
I would say it's probably the turn-based strategy type games. It's probably, Civilization and its descendants, where there's a timeline. It's, again, much like my day job. I'm in 1900 AD, and this is where my tech tree is, and this is where the competitor's tech tree likely is. So I would say it's those sort of games.
Okay. The next section is going to be preferences. So this is kind of lightning round, as quick as you can, yes or no, either or. Do you prefer games, Jaret, that ask you to imagine something, or ones that give you the thing that you're imagining right up front?
Video games, I prefer a known system. I prefer something that tells me up front what the world is.
Okay. Do you play games usually to wind yourself up, so games with action, timers, quick motions, or ones that wind you down, requiring patience, planning, no time limit? Yeah.
Yeah, wind down. It's usually my day is busy enough and I want something to relax to.
Okay. Turn-based or real-time?
I used to like turn-based, but turn-based chews up too much time. Nowadays, I would rather play a real-time game.
Okay. Console, PC, or phone, tablet?
Phone, tablet, last. So that's three, and then it's really hard to say between the other two. I haven't had a reasonable console, in a long time, but I like the simplicity of it. But there's something about keyboard and mouse and the things you can do with that, whether it's a first-person shooter or an RTS, that it has a clear advantage.
Single player or multiplayer?
Multiplayer.
Open world or on the rails?
Open world.
AAA or indie?
Indie. It's really hard to find. It's hard to find the signal to the noise in the indie world. But yeah, indie games for sure.
Okay, and then last one, if you had to put video games that you play into a bucket, art or entertainment, and you had to choose, which one would it be?
For me, it's entertainment. I don't have a particularly well-defined aesthetic sense.
Okay. Okay, well then, interestingly, the next question, this is a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least important, 10 being the most important. How important are aesthetics to you in a game?
I can find games really compelling. If a game feels to me like a graphic novel, that can be a really important part of the game. At the same time, when you strip it down and have like an 8-bit aesthetic or worse, like a black and white pixel aesthetic, there's something compelling about that too, because then it's all about the system.
So it sounds like it could be a 2 or an 8.
That's right. Scale of 1 to 10, 2 or 8.
Story between 1 and 10.
Gonna have to split that one as well. So if it is meant to be a game with a story, it's like 8-9. If it's meant to be open world, if it's meant to be something where you're operating within a system, that's a 2-3. Yeah.
Okay. How important is your PC character?
My PC character.
Your character. How important is your character?
Yeah. So in a game where your character is a stereotype, it's a Mario. It's all of these are coming out as two answers, Ben. This is not helpful. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's an answer in and of itself. The fact that you have this duality of play is itself an answer.
Yeah, when I am just playing a character that somebody else has written, it's unimportant. It's a 2. When it's a character that I have constructed and have leveled to level 110, it's very important, that character to me.
Okay, other characters, NPCs.
A poorly written NPC can kill the game. So that's going to have to be a 6-7.
Mechanics.
Mechanics are vital. So that's, as you can imagine from my previous answers, mechanics are a 9.
Okay. Novelty.
I'm not huge on novelty. I love the occasional game that has a completely different feel or a different mechanic, but generally speaking, I settle into the same old tropes. That's a 4.
Okay. Tradition.
I don't find tradition important. I'm a progressive. I would say tradition is. I like things that evoke nostalgia are interesting, but tradition for the sake of tradition is a 2.
Okay. What about nostalgia? What would that be?
If it's well done. So this is another one of those that's split. I've watched some things recently. I've been watching Star Trek Lower Decks, and the portions of that are well done nostalgia. Of course, it tickles every bone, right? But poorly done nostalgia again can kill a game.
Okay. Last one of the scale of 1 to 10, logic and strategy.
Along with mechanics, I think logic is probably a 6 or 7, but strategy is a 9. That's important.
Okay. You brought this up. We're coming to the end of our time. You brought this up before, the friendships that have grown out of gaming. Is this something that is almost as important as the games themselves, or even maybe more important than the games themselves, the friendships that you've built over the years through games?
For sure. So like Team Fortress is a game that I played with my roommates, or D&D that I played under the playground with friends growing up. Absolutely. The friendships are at least as important as the games.
Okay. And any games right now that you have on your either real shelf or your digital shelf that you're dying to play, waiting to play, and just haven't had the time yet to sink into it?
I haven't even had the time to put the list together, if that tells you where I'm at with my gaming. And yes, I should be playing more games. Play more games, I think I heard someone say.
Okay. Yeah, Jaret, this has been I know this was quick, but there's so much in your answers, and there's so much interesting stuff about the kind of gamer that you are. Very different from some of the other people that I've interviewed. Not just because of the types of games you play, but the things that you're looking for when you play them. So, is there something that we didn't discuss in this conversation, a question that I didn't ask in the questionnaire that either you wish I would have asked or that you feel that was missing from the conversation to really explore what gaming is for you?
Not really. I guess I wasn't sure whether it was going to be mostly about video games or tabletop. I'm always up for discussing either. Board games. Like I know this is not the genre you're looking for, but there is so much more to say about board games. I think sort of the digital components that can be used to augment board games now are interesting. There were some really awkward attempts for a while, but I think they're finding some really novel ways to weave those digital tools into games.
Yeah, that's a tricky one for me. I would love to have this questionnaire for board games as well, but then I know it's going to double the amount of time because most people I'm talking to, are going to not only have 2 answers for video games, but another 2 answers for board games. And it becomes a very broad questionnaire. But it's absolutely interesting and just as provocative for me in the questions that can be asked. Jaret, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been really cool.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it.